Another one
How
of those
critical
broken
it was,
promises,
promise and
the
fact.
that they would support more funding for education.
This is March 5th,
And
2012.
what happened after the election, Madam Speaker?
It might take me a
We
while
ended up
before I
seeing
upload it,
education
but anyway,
funding
March 5th,
frozen
2012.
from 2001 to 2004. And what does that mean, Madam Speaker, when education funding is frozen? It means that school boards are expected to pick up the inflationary costs that are there, which means cuts in programs and services somewhere. And that was the reality from the now Premier, then Minister of Education, was to go back on that promise to support education and to in fact create cuts and more difficulties for school boards. And we saw those cuts happen all across the board. The funding formula was changed, Madam Speaker, to take away the support for small rural schools. And we saw one of the largest school closures over those years, because no longer was there a recognition that sometimes in small rural communities, you have to support a school that's in place and provide funding for that school. But no, the then Minister of Education, now Premier, decided to change that funding formula and took away the ability for those small schools to stay open, which created huge pressures for school boards and therefore huge pressures for teachers in classrooms.
You don't want the baby down there, Sierra.
What else happened during those years when the Premier was Education Minister? Well, we saw, Madam Speaker, that the government and the then Education Minister stripped teachers of their collective agreement. A bill that was overturned in the Supreme Court, where the government was told that they were wrong. What they did was invalid and was unconstitutional. Now, you'd think that a government would have recognized using a heavy hand might not be the direction to go. You would think having the Supreme Court tell you that what you did was unconstitutional and invalid would perhaps send you in a different direction when it came to dealing with teachers and teachers bargaining. Perhaps you might want to try and resolve issues. You might want to show a little respect, a little understanding that what you'd done was wrong. But we didn't see that at all. Instead, we've seen this bill arrive here. Bill 22 arrive here in the legislature, Madam Speaker, without a recognition that this government, in fact, was told by the Supreme Court that what they did was wrong. And I want to read a quote, Madam Speaker, from the Supreme Court judge in that case, because I think it really says everything about why we shouldn't be here, and says everything about the BC Liberals and what they think of teachers and what they think of education. The quote comes from the Supreme Court judge. By passing this legislation without so much as consulting with the BCTF, the government did not preserve the essential underpinning of collective bargaining, namely good faith negotiations and consultation. Good faith negotiations and consultation. That's a direct quote from the Supreme Court judge in a previous bill that came forward that was found to be unconstitutional. And wouldn't you imagine, Madam Speaker, that the government would have listened to that? That they would have paid attention to negotiations, to consultation, to collaboration, and the importance of that. But sadly, Madam Speaker, that's not why we're here in this legislature. I wish we were standing up to talk about how we could strengthen our public education and support teachers. Madam Speaker, wouldn't that be a wonderful conversation to spend our time in this legislature? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be talking about how we could work together to improve our education system, to provide more support for all students and all teachers in our province? Now that would be a good use of legislative time. But instead, Madam Speaker, we're standing here because the government decided once again, as I said earlier, to pick a fight with teachers and to bring in this bill instead of trying to resolve things. In the throne speech, Madam Speaker, which was only this fall, we heard the Premier say, and I quote, "We want to modernize our education system to ensure our teachers have the support they need to provide children with the right skills." That was in October, Madam Speaker. There's another broken promise from this Premier and from the BC Liberals. How is this bill going to provide children with the right skills and provide teachers with the support they need? It's not, Madam Speaker. It's not doing that at all. This legislation doesn't give support, it takes support away, Madam Speaker. This legislation, along with disrespecting teachers, removes support for children, all children in the education system.
Sorry
Now,
about
Madam
that.
Speaker, when the minister introduced this legislation,
What
I heard him
happened there?
talk about discrimination,
Here we go.
and that this bill would ensure that special needs students weren't discriminated against. Well, Madam Speaker, what is discriminating and what is discriminatory is putting students with special needs into a classroom with little or no support. That's what's discriminatory, Madam Speaker. Not allowing those students to receive the attention and the support that they need. And those are heartbreaking stories, Madam Speaker, that I'm certain members on the other side of the House have been told as well, where teachers are doing everything they can to try and provide support, and they go home in tears at the end of the day because they just aren't able to meet the needs of every student. And that's students with special needs and not with special needs who then struggle in that classroom. It's all students then, Madam Speaker, who are struggling in the school. It's all students who aren't getting the kind of education they need. You have to put the supports in place, Madam Speaker. I'm a big supporter of integration. I've spent a large portion of my life working with children and adults with disabilities. I think it's critical to provide opportunities for every child to be able to be educated in our school system, to go to their neighborhood school, to be able to have the same kind of opportunities as every child does, Madam Speaker. But some children need supports to be able to do that, Madam Speaker. And those supports come in a variety of ways, including smaller classes, to be able to provide the teacher with the ability to be able to give the attention that's needed to those children. And this legislation causes that not to happen, Madam Speaker. This legislation says that yes, there's a cap, but it's all right to go over that cap. It's all right to go over that cap if you provide extra resources. Well, I can't tell you how many times I heard this weekend, Madam Speaker, from teachers who said, we don't want the extra resources, we want the smaller classes and the support so we can provide those kids with the best education possible. That's what teachers are looking for. No one goes into the teaching profession unless they care deeply about education and about children, about making sure that they can do the best job possible. No teacher I know went into the profession so they could see government pick a fight with them when they're trying to do a good job in the classroom every single day. But they need the supports for that to happen, Madam Speaker. And what I see with this legislation is that it further erodes those supports and the ability to make sure that teachers have every resource possible to provide for children in classrooms. Now, the legislation also says, and I think it's interesting to take a look at this, Madam Speaker, because we see the government say no to mediation, no, we're not interested, sorry, we're just going to bring in this legislation, we're going to take it forward to an arbitrator with clear direction, not an open mediation process. And yet, the bill itself, Madam Speaker, says to teachers, you'll just collaborate on class size. You'll just work it out. You'll work with everybody in the school, and it'll all just work out. Well, Madam Speaker, the government isn't listening to its own advice. The government isn't sitting down to try and work things out. The government isn't looking at how it can resolve issues. And yet it's saying to teachers, don't worry, it'll all happen in the classroom. You'll work with principals, you'll work with parents, it'll all work out. Well, I'd say to the government, to the BC Liberals, Madam Speaker, they should take a little of their own advice. They should have looked at sitting down and working things out. When you actually had both the employees, the BCTF, and the employers, BCPC, BC Public School Employers Association, saying let's go to mediation, both parties calling for mediation, why on earth wouldn't government have said yes, Madam Speaker? There was a point agreed to by both parties in the negotiations, and usually when you have both parties agreeing to go to a mediator, that provides that wonderful opportunity where you say, let's go and try and resolve this. Let's take this then to mediation. Let's make sure we do everything we can to try and resolve this, to work it out. But instead, we haven't seen that, Madam Speaker. And so what will be the reality? The reality that we've seen over the last 11 years under the BC Liberals in education? That reality, Madam Speaker, will mean larger classes. That reality, Madam Speaker, will mean less resources for education, which will mean fewer supports for students with special needs, fewer teacher librarians, fewer counselors, more school closure. Because the reality is, this budget holds pat. It doesn't increase funding for education in the budget that was tabled by the BC Liberals. And if you don't increase the budget, Madam Speaker, you end up with cuts. Because there has been an increase in MSP premiums, and school boards pay for the MSP premiums in school districts, so there's a cost the boards will have to find from somewhere. They'll have to squeeze those education dollars once more to be able to pay for that. And where does that come from? It comes from the classroom, Madam Speaker. I hear a lot of talk on the other side around change in education, individualized learning, and how important that is. Well, Madam Speaker, one of the keys to individualized learning is time for teachers. It's pretty tough to create individualized learning if you have a larger class and larger numbers of kids with special needs and no supports to provide for them.